I left Cuba when I was 18 in 1960, so that's 50-some years ago. And when I left, I didn't know anything about art. I didn't know art existed. I come from a family where there were no artists. But curiously, I felt that those 18 years in Cuba sort of formed me as an artist. And I think once you're born Cuban, you can't get the Cuba out of you. So in a way, I'm Cuban forever from that background. And for me, it all started here with this family. This is my grandfather. And I grew up, I'm that incredibly cute boy on the lower right with a boat. And I grew up with this extended family of father, mother, and my father's 3 brothers, brother-in-law, and their families. And what happened was that this family every afternoon at the end of the workday would gather in this porch, sit around, highballs would be brought over, and everybody would talk, laugh, tell stories. Telling stories was a very important part of this family, and the stories would be rewarded if they were funny. So I sort of grew up in a comedy club, and that kind of love for stories is something that eventually I sort of adopted. So those men in the picture, they were all in the back. They were all great storytellers, but it never would have occurred to them to put a story down, to write anything. They were purely verbal storytellers. But my mother put it down, and this is a picture of my book. My mother had 5 children, and she kept a baby book for each of the 5 children. And in that baby book, there are little entries for every week, and I have a little story that she wrote about me of something interesting that happened to me every week in my life till I was 2 years old. And then from there on, every month. And the book is full of artifacts and lots of pictures. This artifact is the green parcheesi chip I swallowed when I was 1 year old and later pooped. So the Mendozas in Cuba were very proud of their family history and their background. And they decided to start the family history with this gentleman on the lower right, and his name was Antonio Gonzalez de Mendoza. And he was the first extremely wealthy and extremely successful Mendoza, and possibly the last extremely wealthy and extremely successful Mendoza. So among his many accomplishments, he was the first large Cuban landowner to free his slaves, and he then became the head of a very prestigious law firm, Mayor Havana, and he was when Cuba became a republic in 1902, he was the first Chief Justice of the Cuban Supreme Court. So the family has always been very proud of this guy. And every 5 years, this guy had 8 children, and there's some here, and every one of those children married and had families, and they started this 8 branches. And every 5 years, the 8 branches meet in this gigantic family reunion. And everybody's wearing a different colored polo shirt to determine from what branch they came. And when I was single, I used to love going to these family reunions because about 1,000 people would come and we'd have a weekend together. And the line was, first cousins are off limits. This was a great place for me to meet girls. So anybody wearing my collared shirt, off limits. But everyone else was a kissing cousin. So I left Cuba in 1960, and everybody in the 8 branches that extended large Mendoza family, they also left. Not one person was left behind. And I went to college and studied all the wrong things, engineering first, and then I went to graduate school, architecture. That was a little more to my liking. But I graduated as an architect in 1968, and this was in Boston. And what happened was I got totally seduced by the 60s, the end of the 60s, and what was going on. So I joined every workshop imaginable, sensitivity awareness workshops, primal screen workshops, Rolfing workshops, and eventually, together with 12 men and women, we bought a very large house with 12 bedrooms in Somerville next to Cambridge, and we started an urban commune. This was my sort of genius grant award because my monthly rent and food payments was $120 a month, and that allowed me to become an artist. In fact, everybody here had a profession, and everybody became some sort of an artist, turned to the arts. And I lived there for 9 years. So that sort of got me going, and I looked around, and the only thing that I thought I could do as an artist was photography, something I'd always done since I was 9 or 10. I always had a camera. So when I started doing photography, I learned all I needed to learn, technically speaking. I took some night courses, virtually 2 night classes in photography, learned technique and all that. And my first project was my family. I started photographing everyone in my family. There's a picture of my grandmother with a little story in the show. And my grandmother, when I took this picture, she was 86. She was incredibly healthy and sharp. And I told her, Grandma, why don't we do a book together? We'll use this picture for the front cover, and you can tell in the book all about your exercise routine and your eating habits. And she said, okay, my favorite food is chunks of pork cooked in lard. I sprinkle plenty of salt on everything. I've never done exercise in my entire life. So that was the end of the book. All the women in this picture are related to me. So the women, like the men in my family, they like to talk. And the thing that I think about my family that's typically Cuban is that my family just loves to converse, talk, laugh, have fun, and everybody has, a story to tell. So that to me is part of what being Cuban is. We're a very gregarious kind of people. When I ran out of relatives, I started photographing my girlfriends, and then my girlfriend's dogs. So this is a black dog that became my first extended project that actually saw the light of day, and that I won an NEA grant and was shown in a gallery and so on. And it established my operation, my procedure as to what I would do as a photographer, and that is, I sort of started photographing anything that was around my house. So my family, my friends, my girlfriends, dogs, whatever. So from there, after I did that project, I decided I was ready to try to really make it as an artist. I had to leave Boston because nothing much happens in Boston, being so near New York. So I went to New York, I got a loft, and shared a loft with a painter, and the painter had this cat. So I looked at the cat and I figured, okay, something in my house, that's my next project. So I photographed this cat pretty extensively for about 2-3 years. And that eventually became the first photography book I did. And initially, I had a lot of great pictures of the cat. I would put him in a box, take it to publishers, and it got rejected something like 30 sometimes, a lot of times. Somebody said, can't publish a book with just pictures if you're not famous. You gotta have a story in there. So I said, okay, I wrote a little story about my life with a cat, and the first publisher who saw the project with the story, he said, I love this, let's publish it. So that gave me the idea that maybe I could write, because that was the first time in my life I'd written anything, this short little story of living with this cat. So then my next project became a project of stories of people, again using the family and pictures I had done, of people in my life, and then it sort of became a memoir. And a lot had to do with my family growing up in Cuba, and then having had sort of this interesting experience of participating in the 60s, living in a commune, then trying to make it as an artist in New York. This story says, Yeye sisters, Magda, Tota, and Manana, used to make me nervous. Every time I saw them, they were always laughing. I was afraid to talk to them and run the risk of not being considered funny. So again, it's that Cuban thing of humor and so on. And here's my girlfriend. Anna and I were a couple in the commune. We didn't believe in being possessive or jealous, and enjoyed a satisfying relationship for 2 years. When we separated, we decided we were mature enough to stay in the house and deal with the difficult feelings surrounding new mates. Anne became involved with Mark and other men in the house. I became possessive and jealous. And this is probably one of my favorite stories. Students love this one. I attended 5 years of private school, 4 years of college, 3 years of graduate school before I became an architect. In 1973, 5 years after graduation, I quit architecture, became an artist photographer. For the first 10 years, I never earned more than $8,000 a year. In 1977, some college loans came due. In addition, I defaulted on my charge cards and my Evergreen bank account. After a while, creditors grew impatient and handed over my accounts to collection agencies. After many threatening letters, I politely informed everyone that I was now an artist and continually broke and should be considered a total loss. I kept receiving their threatening letters. Finally, I sent each a collage of the letters with a contact strip of myself eating a banana. I never heard from my creditors again. And one final one. My parents came to Boston in 1968 for my graduation from architectural school. After the ceremony, my father, who loved lobster, wanted to celebrate in one of Boston's seafood restaurants. We ordered a table, but the head waiter informed us that we couldn't be served because I wasn't wearing a tie. Earlier that year, I had decided that ties were a symbol of the establishment. My father, who was outspoken, started screaming, furious at the restaurant and at me. Nevertheless, I didn't wear a tie again until 1983. When I was visiting Ana Maria and Herman in Florida, we were invited to a wedding. I borrowed a white suit, shirt, and tie from Herman. Looking at myself in the mirror, I felt unusually opulent and handsome. During the party that night, I noticed women looking at me often. Afterwards, I started wearing suits and ties. So this book this project became a book, and eventually it was shown at the Museum of Modern Art. It was in that series of exhibitions they call New Photography, and I was the first person shown in that thing that's become a tradition. And my work in the show is pictures from this other project. And again, Cuba is this thing you can't get out of your system. So what happened to me was I kind of ignored Cuba for many, many years. I just loved being an American and living in America and what America did for me, what it provided. And eventually, though, this kind of immense nostalgia kind of took over, and I felt, I have to go back to this place. I have to see the places where I grew up that I haven't been able to see and all that. And I went back. I didn't care a lot for the political regime there and all that, but I simply had to go back, see the beach where I grew up, the home in Havana where I grew up, the farm where I would go all the time. And I went back to Cuba. I was there only for 2 weeks. And I found the place to be like the perfect surreal landscape. Everything in Cuba to me was interesting and strange. You know, like scenes like this. For Cuba, they seem absolutely normal. And some of these photographs are in the show. This is the father confessor, the man who has to go to work even though he has absolutely nothing to sell. And he's there all day, and all the neighborhood people come in and they tell him their problems. And he offers advice, and they move on. So Cuba was wonderful to photograph, and then while I was there, I talked to a lot of people. I kept a diary. So every night I would write in my diary all the things that I had talked about during the day with the people I talked to. And I put all that together into that book. And I'll end here with this project, which again is another one of these Cuban things that I haven't been able to get out of my system. And what happened to me was, when I was 13, I was a pretty crazy and adventurous kid. And I had a best friend, this guy, his name was Machete. So anybody with a name like that, you know he's going to be in trouble. But I'll just start this. When we were 13, Machete and I were sent to Choate, a Connecticut all-boys prep school, where we quickly became best friends and also managed to have more than our share of crazy teenage mindless adventures. High up on the list, at 13, we decided we were old enough to go to the Mambo Club, one of Havana's most elegant brothels. And even worse, a few years later, we met 2 American girls our age vacationing in Havana. After some spirited dates, we decided we were in love. Unfortunately, their vacation ended and the girls returned to their homes in Miami. We wanted to continue the festivities. The next day, we left notes in our beds and left for Miami at 4 a.m. from the Havana Yacht Club in Machete's 14-foot aluminum outboard. We took sandwiches, water, a compass, maps, a .22 rifle, a few fishing lines, and enough gasoline. Our outboard motor died within an hour. When it died, we couldn't see the Cuban coastline anymore. And our boat was bobbing in these gigantic swells in the middle of nowhere in the ocean. Luckily, our parents read the notes we left, and Machete's father, who was a very important man in Cuba, called the President of the Republic. And he sent the Coast Guard out, and they found us, and we returned to the island. So what happened was just memories of being 13 and being a completely crazy kid at that time, and being part of the city of Havana, being able to explore it, was a very unique memory in my mind. And I always felt I had a book in me, only one book. That's all I'm going to do as far as its novels are concerned. But I've been writing this book for something like 20 years, a little bit every summer, adding something, taking something off. And finally I felt, okay, it's done, and it was published last week. So I'm very proud about it.